Hey guys, it's David here. I've been trying to figure out different things to do on Authortube, um, and the best I could think of, other than trying to do tags and stuff, was to figure out what things, when I was learning to write and do books and stuff, what were the things that were transformative for me. And I had a thought, what was the one thing that I wish I knew when I first started writing? And for me, that would probably be what's called the Snowflake Method of plotting. I don't know, it was all the rage 10 years ago. I don't know if other people know about it or not, but I thought I might as well talk about it, how it works for me and how I use that to write books. And I say this with a little tiny bit of authority because I've written 6 books. The middle book was each of the first and second books were about 100,000 words. The third book is 300 and I think 60,000 or 40,000 words, and the next books are just over 100 each. So 6 books. I've also written half of a big book, which is probably going to be sort of 500,000 words total. I haven't figured out how to publish it or present it or whatever yet, but so I'm not a newbie writer. I have actually written quite a few books, and all but the first book that I published, which isn't actually the first in the series. Time Speaker is technically the second book in the series, but all but Time Speaker I used the Snowflake Method, which I discovered when I was first learning about NaNoWriMo. Now the Snowflake Method is, I think of it more as a fractal method, if you will, because the basic idea of the Snowflake Method is to figure out what you want to say, and then take a bit of what you want to say and expand it out, and then take a bit and then expand it out and expand it out and expand it out until you've got a whole plot for a book. Now, the actual practical use of it isn't as formulaic as it sounds, because anyone who writes anything knows that the muse and the story, or the characters, and all the characters, have a mind of their own. So it doesn't always work. I think Rise of Hawk was really bad for not complying to the Snowflake Method. But I thought I'd use my general method to illustrate this idea. So I've got lots of ideas for books and series and stuff. And after my current series, which is 12 books, I'm halfway through, I've got another series in that timeline, and then I'm going to go back and do histories. And one of the history stories, and it's 13,000 years before the current day story, so it's not going to be a sequel, it's going to be its own story, is what I've currently been calling the Maran Dragon Riders. I'm going to have a better name for it, hopefully. And it's been an idea in the back of my head for years and years and years, pretty much since I read Anne McCaffrey's Dragon series as well. Because I thought, who wants to do dragons? You know, it's all sort of, it's become sort of a meme, you know, overused and sort of boring. And then I read I think it was actually the White Dragon, and I thought, ooh, you know, I could take this idea and change it. And I've been ferreting away on it for, 10, 15 years, because it's just an idea, you know. How do I put dragons in a science fiction universe? And I'm getting enough ideas right now to start with the basic plotting. So all of my books start with an idea. And with the Maran Dragon Riders, the idea is of a boy who's isolated from the people around him, and he goes wandering in the forest and meets a dragon. And this dragon is not like the other dragons. He too is a social outcast, and they be friends. They become friends. And then the story goes on from there, and I'm not going to give you any spoilers. But the basic starting idea was two socially isolated individuals, one is a boy, one is a dragon, meeting and bonding. And so for the Snowflake Method, I would start with just writing that down, which I have, it's in my Evernote file. That's the basic starting concept. Rise of Hawk, the starting concept was, well, the reason why I did Rise of Hawk was, okay, what's all the information that I need to add to the story so that readers don't get lost with Time Speaker? But the question is two siblings who experience fascism in a different way, and how do they resolve it, basically. And so, and then I would start by going, okay, what's the background of the boy? In the case of the Maran Dragon Riders, what's the background of the boy? And write a big blurb about that. What's the background about the dragon? Write a blurb about that. And then take another detail and expand it out. So why is the boy socially outcast? Because the Maran is his tribe, his region, his people, well, the people around him are called the Maran. That's the name of their nation. And a neighbouring nation of Tishala, they're at war. Maran and Tishala are at war. And an army went over to Tishala, wiped out a village, and the only person who survived was a baby version of the boy. They took the baby home and brought the kid up. And so, because he's racially different, he's a social outcast because he's the enemy. Even though he grew up, his village is his home, not his original birth village. And so you take a detail with the Snowflake Method and you expand it. And to do a book, I keep expanding until I get a book, until I get an overarching story. The Maran Dragon Riders are basically the Maran soldiers are losing. The Tishalan soldiers are winning. They're kicking their ass, and they're going to kill all of them. And the Maran soldiers need something to change so they survive. And the change is the boy's friendly dragon helping. And then go on from there. Because I'm hoping to expand it into maybe a 5 or a 6 book series. It depends on how much extra story I can add to it. It's currently just a little story. I originally plotted it as a trilogy. But the first book will be about the boy and the dragon. The next books will be about more dragons and more young people bonding with dragons. And where that leads and all that kind of stuff. Now, with Rise of Hawk, because I have to use an example that's out there in the world. My book is actually out there, although it's not on Amazon yet. What I do is I basically start with that summary, and then I expand each section of the summary in order. So I think, okay, I want these things to happen in the book. And usually for me, it actually comes out in 5 parts. So part 1 is generally me introducing the main characters, the situation they find themselves in, what the world is like, that sort of thing. And then part 2 is sort of introducing the conflict, the difficulties, the threats that build up into the main conflict. Often my part 2 and my part 3 are usually where people die. lots of people die. So part 3 is usually my first climax, or builds up to the first climax, and sometimes it's the first climax which ends in a low. I believe Time Speaker part 3 it ends on a low. Then part 4, especially with Rise of Hook, it's sort of, part 3 ended on a low, where they went to Rona and they didn't get what they needed, what they wanted, and everyone's like, oh my god, what are we going to do now? How do we deal with this? And then part 4 is sort of them dealing with the consequences of that and building up to the conflict, the primary climax. But it's in Rise of Hawk, it's building down, and then part 5 is usually the primary conflict, and or primary conflict first, and then the end, like an epilogue, or you know, this is how they survived, or whatever, or it builds up to the conflict, it ends on the conflict, like in Trinidad. And so with the Snowflake Method, I would get part 1, and I'd go through the basic things that need to be established. Like part 1 for the Modern Dragon Riders, the first book, would be introducing the boy and his background, introducing the dragon and his background, having a general sort of, this is what the world is like, sort of sequence. And then part 2 will start with the boy meeting the dragon, or at least the circumstances that build up to meeting the dragon. Although depending on how the muse goes, I might actually end up them meeting the dragon, the boy meeting the dragon at the end of part 1. So I take part 1 and put the rest of the book aside and then go, okay, what are all the things that need to happen in part 1 for that goal, that blurb, to be completed? And I'd split it up into bits. Like, I've already decided I want to start with the dragon first, because he's actually got a long story arc that actually links to the current day in the story, in a slightly indirect way. So I'd start and I'd go, okay, these things need to happen. I need to establish the Black Dragon's history. I need to establish his place in his pack or flock, or whichever word, collective noun I'm going to use to describe a group of dragons, because he's the oldest, he's intelligent, he's a lot more sort of human-y sentient like than the other dragons, so he's completely bored out of his skull, because they're all like, ooh, toy, ooh, food. They're basically giant dogs. And he's sort of a little bit more aware of himself and a little bit more aware of the world, and far more fascinated by the little crunchy things that walk around on the flat below the mountains. And then I'd go through all the bits that need for him to happen, for him to get to that point, and then hand off to the introduction to the boy and his background and his interactions with his peers and his elders, how he feels about the village, what he wants to do, his motivations, do his introduction, what's going on for him, and then build up probably to the meeting with the dragon. So I take part 1, do overviews for all the bits that need to happen in the story, and then I take one bit of all of those bits in part 1 and put it into sections of story scenes. I usually start with bullet points, and I just keep taking a section until I get to scene descriptions, scene by scene descriptions. And I don't usually do the whole book scene by, do the whole Snowflake Method to the scene description level for the whole book. I only do like part 1 and do the overviews for the other parts, so I know where I want to head, and then I start writing. Especially with part 1, because part 1 is also sort of getting to know the characters, building the characters, and I'm pretty sure the dragon, he's going to be a very opinionated pain in the ass, particularly for me, because I always have at least one opinionated character. Nama was Rise of Hawk. Giselle was Time Speaker. Giselle blocked my writing of Time Speaker for 2 years because he didn't want to be Jaola's kicking stone, wrong word, whipping boy. He wanted to be a main character. 2 years of blockage because the character wasn't happy. And I'm pretty sure the dragon's going to cause me trouble because he's already a voice in my head. And once I've done part 1, I usually know sort of the voice, each of the voices of the main characters. With Rise of Hawk, it took a little longer because there were 4 main characters. It started off with Asha and Talon, as well as Nalana and Nama. So there were 4 of them, and a lot of Nama's sort of background happened later on because there wasn't enough room. But once I've done part 1, I usually know their voice, I know whether they're going to be difficult, I know their motivations, I know more details, because it usually just sort of happens in the process of writing. And then I go to the next part and do it, reduce the summaries, or expand the summaries to scene breaks, and then just keep going. Sometimes I have to go back to the beginning and fit extra scenes in to build up new details. But the Snowflake method is basically get a detail, expand it. Get a detail, expand it, which is why I think of it more like a fractal. And this is actually how I do all of my writing. That's how I do my series plotting. I've got Evernote files on each of my future books, like a blurb for each of the books, and then I'll have a folder and I'll expand each of the sections, and then I'll put it into a folder or on paper. Like I'm always doing, I don't know if you can see the details, although you don't need to see too much details. This is a scene blurb. I just list the scenes and a general sentence. And then I take that and I expand. That's a whole scene. And there's a scene and there's a scene. And just keep expanding at different scales. I know basically where the 12-book series is going to end and what happens, but I don't know what's going to happen in detail until I start writing the book. The Mara and Dragon Riders is more just sort of I want dragons in TSU, so I'm going to figure it out. And it's been a long-term project for a while now. Like a lot of other projects I've got, because I can't do nothing. I have to be doing something. Even when I'm really, really sick and I can't physically do anything. I'm always tick, 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 tick. What about this thing? What about that thing? And when I get bored or stuck or irritated with something, I'll go and do something else. Anyway, that's probably as far as I can go without giving too many spoilers. But the Snowflake Method, if you actually look it up, I'm pretty sure there's still lots of files and descriptions of it. It was really common when I found it. It was actually done by, I think it was created by a particular writer. If I can find the original article that I found, I'll try and put it in the description. But it transformed how I wrote books. Absolutely transformed. I used to be a pantser and I would just sort of write in a direction and hope it worked. So I'd write in a direction and then something wouldn't work and I'd have to go back and keep adding new scenes or new perspectives or new details, and then keep going a little further, and then I'd get stuck and then I'd go back and I would just zigzag back and forth and back and forth until I got to the end of the book. It took me 4 years to finish Time Speaker in its current form, well, its current recognizable form, because I kept coming across a problem in the story and I'd have to go back and replot it, and it made error correcting really hard. Whereas the Snowflake Method sort of you can see the story before you've written it, can see it relatively clearly, so you can fill in the plot holes. And like I need it primarily because I don't have one main character, and my perspective isn't from one person's point of view. I write the story from the point of view that makes the most interesting perspective on that particular event. So like technically Hawk is probably the main character. I mean, well, he's the time speaker. He's probably not a main character. He's probably more like a what is it called? There's a writing archetype of the character you don't generally make a main character because they're too powerful. At least on and off. Originally in the first 2 books he knew too much, and the story was boring because, you know, when you find out who he is, everything makes sense and you think, oh, it's not as scary as it sounds, at least for me. And so I wrote it from primarily Asha and Talon's point of view, the Rise of Hawk, but I had to add in other perspectives to make it interesting. Because it's the story I'm telling, it's not a hero's journey story. There isn't one main character, one hero who saves the day. It's multiple. It's actually close to 20 people who eventually save the day, or build up to the end of the series where everything comes into alignment and is mostly resolved. So when I do this Snowflake method, it helps me keep up with what perspectives, what needs to be said, what parts of the story needs to be said, and then which perspective should give that piece of information or that perspective on the story, that part of the story, to be interesting. So I need it to keep up with everything. I've got multiple timelines that overlap each other, multiple characters with different influences, and different goals. And other than Jaren Cody Sr. and Hoyo Mala, there aren't really any, like, traditionally bad guys. Even the big epic bad guys aren't just like evil people, you know, twiddling their little tiny beards and going, "Wahaha, I'm evil." You know, there's none of that sort of big archetypical good versus evil stuff. It's a bunch of people doing the best they can with what they've got. And some of them have less than others. Some of them aren't mature, some of them aren't empathic, and some of them have conflicting goals and motivations. But everyone is a person. Even Jaren Cody Sr., who's the head of the agency, who are the bad guys in the first 3 books. Although I wouldn't want to try and humanise Hoyle very much. You find out how horrible he is in Banshee Haven. It helps me to keep up with stuff. I imagine different stories and different methods of writing. If you have a one character kind of story, you probably don't need necessarily to use the Snowflake method quite as detailed as I do. But it's really good for managing details and getting your head around sections of story. But I have a 12-book series, so it's kind of it's self-inflicted complexity for me. Anyway, it's 25 minutes, so it's time to say goodbye. I hope that was not so rambling. Ara ni tasa. There we go.